This video is edited from a webinar that I did for the Research Information Network and is a summary of the work that was done for the BIM Hub project at Loughborough University. Now, the idea of talking through the BIM Hub project is partly as a dissemination activity, but it's also to present the BIM Hub project as a case study, but really to use that as a way to expand upon the whole idea of online collaboration, and online collaboration particularly for design and educational learning activities that work with design. So that's the opening slide. So you can see BIM Hub and mine and Robbie's names, and also we've been given this platform through Stefan Goldstein through the RIN, and he's allowed us to connect with his network to show, because he said that you particularly are a networker interested in digital literacy, and this is a particular digital literacy that I think not necessarily is overlooked. It's just that I don't think there's enough awareness of some of the specific literacies that are important for supporting online collaboration, and particularly online collaboration through design. So that's kind of the focus that we're looking at. Now, the second slide is the one with the big heart on, and it says I love books. Now, this is a project that I'm also working on through Coventry University, and it's the organisation CARNET, which is the Croatian Academic Research Network. They're hosting this for us. This is an interesting parallel because this also looks at online collaboration, and it's a project that also looks at online collaboration and with specifically some design elements, but it's a completely different subject discipline and a very different age group. So whereas the BIM Hub project, which is mainly what I'm talking about today, is to do with construction engineering and with undergraduates, the Amoris project is about literacy and about a love of literature and books with secondary school children. And what's been interesting working on the two in parallel is the number of overlaps and the number of similar sorts of digital literacy issues both of the projects raise, irrespective of age group and irrespective of subject discipline. So I think this is one of the things that makes it useful for lots of, from me, that makes it generalizable. A lot of the things we're looking at here are generalizable to lots of different age groups and lots of different subject disciplines. Okay, so talking specifically about the BIM Hub project, it's basically, we ought to big up our sponsors a bit, which is it's funded by the Higher Education Academy, and it's been running for 18 months. It finished last month, so we've, no, 2 months ago now, and we've finished analysing the data, which is why we're able now to do this particular webinar. Not only that, but it's funded, there was a previous project that it followed on from, which was funded by Hewlett-Packard, the HP Catalyst program, which was another year or 2 years before that. So altogether, we're talking about 4 years of experience with this sort of stuff. And the project Loughborough, Coventry and Ryerson. Now, why this might be interesting specifically for Satwinder and the architecture course is that what we had here was, it was collaborative practice. It was architects in one place, Ryerson, construction engineers in another place, Coventry, and project managers in Loughborough University. So our idea was we would create teams from these 3 locations, 2 students from each, to all work on a project all at the same time. And this, in a sense, was giving chance to work on collaboration about working on some of the practices that they needed to be able to do collaboratively, but specifically collaboration at a distance. So if we go on to the 4th slide, which is the one with squares and a little oval on there. Now, this is something we got from the original project, the HP Catalyst project. So this is where we started off from, looking at our BIM Hub project. And our idea was it's working on the kind of concept of transactional distance. Whistling, you can whistle, but we probably need to turn the mic off if you're going to whistle. Or something. No, it's not a whistle, it's some sort of siren. Somebody can Whoever that is can turn the mic off, because I think everybody can hear that then. Brilliant. Okay, so the idea of transactional distance is in any communication there are things that impede the communicator and the two people communicating, and technology just adds something a bit more complex to that mix. So it's not looking at technology as being a huge new additional problem, it's just one of lots of different things, cultural practices and languages and all those different sorts of things. And we looked at this input-output process as basically the input is what are all the issues that occur when two people are trying to communicate at a distance, and then we looked at what the students did to try and address some of those problems and learn from what the students did, and that's what we called an alignment. So our basic idea is there are these two groups of students, or in this original project it was two. There's a problem, or there are things impeding their communication. How are those two different places brought closer together? And then as far as output goes, it's what are all the different sorts of things that they get from that. And I'm sorry, just another couple more slides just to give you the background, and then we'll start chatting about where we've all got to. So this is something else that came from that original project, was that we noticed that there are really two kinds of different sort of cycles that students get into, two kind of feedback loops. One of them drives students towards problems with collaboration. And these are things like they're not necessarily that committed in the first place, therefore they withdraw from the collaboration, or they withdraw their full commitment from their collaboration. They then start not completing tasks on time, trust starts to diminish. But then what the students are saying is not only, oh, there are problems with trust, there are problems with collaboration, there's problems with communication. They also start making out that, or it's possibly true, but for them then all of the other issues that come with online collaboration, oh, we had a poor link, oh, we had time zone problems, oh, we had technical problems, all of those became, in their perception, overpowering barriers. So what we found with, and going on to the next slide, which is the cycle going in the other direction, is that where we had students that were more committed to the collaboration, were more effective at some of the cooperative activities, they became more able to complete their tasks on time, they trusted each other more, and therefore all of the issues, and they had the same issues as those that were the collaborations that were failing, with time zone confusion and with bandwidth problems and with breakdowns in the audio and all those sorts of things. Although they had the same technical problems, they weren't perceived as insurmountable barriers. Everything else compensated for that. So we went into this project with this idea that actually all of these sorts of strategies, their ability to collaborate, their ability to communicate, their attitude towards cooperation, those are the things that really made the difference rather than any technical platform issues. So has anyone got any questions about that, about where we got through from the original project? Yes, we did. And what was interesting, Joe, was that going into, we had two quite different cohorts of students. In the first project, which was just Coventry and Ryerson in Canada, and then in the third one, Coventry, Ryerson and Loughborough. And one of the biggest differences with the levels of motivation was that the Coventry students' degree module had a much bigger cohort of students. So what that meant that although all of the students within Coventry had to do a collaborative task, I think about 3/4 of the students in Coventry could collaborate with other Coventry students. So there were architecture students in Coventry and other structural engineer students in Coventry, and so all of the tasks that they had to do within that module, they could do with other Coventry students. The collaboration with Ryerson was running in parallel, and for the Coventry students, for those that opted into it. And in Ryerson and in Loughborough, in the second project, all of the students are in there. Now, Robbie can help me with that question as Robbie's around. I think, no, we had 40 students in Ryerson, 40 students in Loughborough, but in Coventry we had something like 120 students. But of course only 40 of those opted to do the online collaboration thing. And the Coventry student, we found that a lot of the Ryerson students and a lot of the Loughborough students were disengaged from the process, not because they didn't want to collaborate or because they didn't want the marks, but they found being motivated to engage with the online features of the collaboration. Some of them struggled with that. Whereas the Coventry ones, fewer did because they knew what they'd volunteered for it. They'd got themselves set up for it. They knew that online collaboration was part of the deal, and so therefore there were fewer of them that actually responded negatively to the whole idea of working online. Right, yes, so okay, so that gives you the overall over the 4 academic years. So it's a huge cohort altogether. But Robbie's talking about the 60 per year that are involved with the online component. Now, the individual groups collaborating, in the first project, it was groups of 4, so two from each university is the standard model. And then when we went to the BIM Hub project, the one which included Loughborough, we had another 2 students from Loughborough, so forming teams of 6. And I think that's another, just from a sheer logistical point of view, this is partly why I think the 3-way collaboration it surfaced more problems than the 2-way collaboration, simply because there were bigger groups. We've got groups of 6 rather than groups of 4, so there are more opportunities for students that weren't quite so motivated to mess up the collaborations. Yes, it's complex. I think it's the logistics are more complicated because you've got to organise 3 groups of 2, but it's also that the larger the group, the more non-participative students you're likely to get, because you're all within any group. You're going to get some students, whether they're irrespective of university or whatever. You're going to get some students that really aren't trying hard enough. Okay. So I'll come on to the task because, Joe, that's an essential issue, I think, what extent the task is meaningful for all and the degree to which it's meaningful for all the students. So that's an essential element of the task design, which I'll mention later. But I think where there was only any distinction between the 3 universities as far as this opting in was I've worked a lot with online, with getting people to work online. And you'll always find a certain element of students for whom online interactions just aren't meaningful. And I think this is something that we can work to address to some extent, but with this sort of work, it's always going to be an issue, and it's always going to be a barrier which this sort of stuff presents, which other things don't, which is we were getting feedback like, oh, working with screens just isn't engaging. And we find this actually working with industry partners as well, is people that have come from industry say, well, I would rather spend it. We could say, well, this is great. You can do this online collaboration. You can just go online, talk for an hour to have a meeting or 2 hours, and then go offline, and that's just as good. And they will say, no, I would rather spend a day or 2 days traveling for a meeting because it means more to me to meet people. And I think this element of meaningfulness of online interactions is, I think, something that's not really spoken about a lot in the literature. It is to some extent. It's not spoken a lot about when we come to designing activities or working with students on this, and I think it's issue. Okay, yes, this is another very good point as well, that the literacies are developing in professional value for employability, and this is something I think I will address in another later slide. Yes, I agree. I agree that it's meaningful. I agree that it's an essential part of our lives from now on. So much of our life is spent online, interacting online, learning to interact effectively online and manage our digital presence, manage our digital literacy. It's not something that is being addressed enough in education at the moment. We don't do on the whole, professional skills for online collaboration. We don't do professional skills for being online, how to manage your Facebook presence and your WordPress presence and all this sort of stuff. We don't do enough of that, I don't think, within to prepare our students for the world of work. And I think part of the issue as well is taking our lead from where the industries are at. Robin, I had a conversation about the construction industry last week, and he was saying, you know, some of the construction engineers, they're not as up with this, in business they're not as up with this as perhaps they should be at this point. And I think we can't take our lead entirely from where the industry is, because if we talk to the industry, there's a lack of awareness of their own needs for these sorts of skills. But I think the industry is going to change because the way that our digital lives is changing, and I think we need to prepare our students for the industry the way it will be in the future, not the way it is now. Yes, not only that, but and again, we're going back to Joe's question about motivation. The students were, even the ones that didn't like it, even the ones that felt that actually their collaboration hadn't been that successful, still said it was really good for them to have done it, because it's about CV packing, it's stuffing, it's about actually having a competitive advantage when it comes to applying for jobs. They can stick this on their CVs, they can say that they've acquired these skills and done this sort of stuff, and they feel that this will actually put them in a better position for the world of work when it comes to it. So the amount of motivation from all of the students, even the ones that didn't like the online interaction, were all very positive because they felt that this was a great thing for them to do. Yeah, okay. So let me move on to the triangle picture. Now the triangle picture is where it's an extra level of kind of nuances where we got to as a result of this project. And this was, yes, we do get these positive and negative feedback loops in that when things are work, they become more successful, people become more engaged, and so they work more effectively, or they become disengaged and they work less effectively. But they work on lots of different sorts of levels. And you've got to get the basic levels sorted before you move on to the next one, before you move on to the next one, which is why it's a pyramid, because you have to get the base level in place before you can really start thinking about the next thing. And you can see there the different levels that we sort of really kind of focused on. Okay, so let's start with the basic level, and I think the thing that's key to getting sorted before you go any further, and some of this might seem self-evident. I think the first thing, obviously, but worth saying, I think, is that if you're starting off something like this, what are you trying to achieve? What are the goals? What are the things that your students really need to be able to achieve by the end of it? So the first level, or the 1 point on this PowerPoint presentation, are just abbreviated to satisfying requirements. And one of these is the professional practices for literacy skills. So you may be working with us. We worked with the building industry that has a code of conduct, that has a set of professional practices. And it's interesting that if you go to any skill set that's laid out by any professional body, yes, there's the subject knowledge, but that's only a small part of the whole thing. And the vast majority of it is to have the communication skills, the networking skills, the communication skills, and all that sort of stuff. And I think as I was saying, that is perhaps something that's overlooked as far as the online communication collaboration goes, but I think it's something that we need to think about addressing for our students. I think another thing as well is that, and again, I think it was Joe earlier said about motivation, is that does the task seem authentic? Is it actually being set up in a way that makes sense? So I think coming up with a project that, okay, this is probably the most difficult thing with online collaborative stuff, is that we've tried online stuff with people just within one university, and of course it doesn't work. It seems inauthentic because they're saying, well, why do we have to go home to talk to people when we can do it while we're in the university? Hopefully the people that are doing in Sheffield that are doing the online collaborative practice, you found a way to keep them from working directly with each other face to face. So for us, the idea of actually working out online collaborative stuff, we had to include universities from outside because without that, there's no point in being online, and without that online component being forced upon the students, it's inauthentic. So that then creates, because you're working with other projects, you've got to find things that will actually be, as I think Joe pointed out, you've got to have stuff that's equally as valid and equally as important for all of the students involved. So when you're setting up the design project, then evidently you need to make it worthwhile for each of the students. Not necessarily equally, but equal to the amount of assessed marks that they're getting from it. So if their assessment is a small proportion of it, then they're working a small amount, if they're working a large amount, and so on. What you don't want is something that one group of students has got to commit to way more than another. It's way more important than their module, and yet they're not getting the same amount of support from each other through doing it. So I think that sort of setting it up and thinking through who's doing what is important for the next step of engaging and maintaining commitment from all of the, not only from all of the students, but also from all of the members of staff that that they're going to be involved in it. You need to align and modify the practices at the different universities. So, you know, the points at which, the degree to which things are being assessed, those sorts of things, and also, of course, scheduling. And scheduling is enormously difficult because everybody starts and finishes at the same time. Finding the right module. So as we were lucky, well, not necessarily lucky, but one I think the strongest points about our project was that we had architecture, we had construction engineers. Those are two modules that are both running simultaneously in different universities and actually different countries, and so therefore, and those are, of course, disciplines that you normally have working with each other. And so if you're doing something with collaborative practice, then you would need collaborative practice with groups of students, with groups of disciplines that normally work with each other. So I'm just having a read that. I've just had a look at that link. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work I've done is with JISC. I think the most recent thing was the JISC Transformations Program. And I know that I've looked at the JISC design stuff through the... Yeah, I mean, and Helen and Rona really know their stuff. Oh, they've used a pyramid as well. Yes, I might have, I don't know if I subconsciously drew on their pyramid model, but yeah, and I think working with JISC, and I mean, I've fed back to JISC because some of the stuff that we've done here. My last seminar was with their experts, the Learning and Teaching Experts program. So I think, yeah, I think it's important to draw on stuff that's already gone on before. So getting those bases right, and I think being able to find collaborators whose needs with their students tie in with the needs for your students, and choosing a technology you can all use, getting those basics right before moving on to some of the more digital literacy aspects is, I think, key. Okay, I'm going to look at the second level now, moving up the pyramid. And this is with the design of activities. Now, I've already mentioned that you need to find something that's meaningful to all of the people involved. And I think if it's a work-based type of thing, which is getting students who are working disciplines that normally work together on a discipline in a team, in a workplace environment that would work together, so architects and designers and engineers and managers, is an authentic group. It's something that is work-based, and there are models that we can all draw on, I think, from no matter what our subject discipline, that actually can be modeled like that in a learning environment. There's always an element of inauthenticity about this because, of course, it's got to be assessed, and you're not assessed in the same way that you might be in the workplace, but I think that is a great basis for starting. But where I think where we ran into some issues was that we all, between us, the staff in each separate place came up with a design brief, and then they tweaked it a bit when they presented it to their students, and so therefore it drifted apart a bit, and so they all ended up with slightly different design briefs. And therefore there was some confusion, particularly in the early stages, because some students thought they were doing one thing, some students thought they were doing something else. So I think one of the things that this sort of online collaborative design project highlights is not only that because is because you're getting the students to work collaboratively online and collaboratively create something between them and have all these digital literacy skills. It pushes us as educators to really raise our game as far as our online collaboration goes. And I think that's something that's easy to underestimate. And I think it's that no matter what our digital literacies are, that there's always gaps and there's always things that we can presume that we can actually accomplish and we don't. And I think when we're looking at the amount of labour intensiveness that some of this stuff can create, the fact that you've got to go online, you've got to have these conversations, you've got to have Skype meetings quite frequently, and you've got to build those into your normal working routine in a way that face-to-face meetings are, but face-to-face meetings are perhaps easier to do, then I think I'm just flagging that as something that we should always really be aware of. And we perhaps weren't enough. Students' marks, so I think I alluded to this earlier, that if you've got these different things happening in different places, then you need to make sure all of the marks are make sense, that they're all that the students benefit from the marking scheme is commensurate with their input to the project, and that's sometimes difficult to balance between the different groups. And also with peer assessment. Students hated peer assessment. They always hate peer assessment, but if you can make the peer assessment as transparent as possible, if you can then make the degree to which their marks are affected by their peers the same between all three universities, then there will be fewer problems. The difficulties with peer assessment is that if you plan out the peer assessment marks independently of each other, and one group is, it's 60% of their mark and another one is 10%, then that's just a recipe for aggrievement between the different students. And then finally, this is an interesting thing, was that some of the students said that, well, we don't always want to do something that's subject specific, because if we've got a project management stuff, they will automatically do it. If we've got an architecture designs, they will automatically do it. We're being pigeonholed into our different subject disciplines, and we want something where we can actually work out the tasks between us, where we can work more cooperatively, and we can come to some sort of activity between us. And I think if you only do things that are embedded within the different subject disciplines, then you won't get that in-depth collaboration, because the students will naturally gravitate towards doing the tasks that belong specifically to that subject discipline and no others. So going back to, so I think one of the things that is really useful is to have a common portal for all students from all the universities, so you've not only got transparency, you've got equivalence between all of the different information that you give to each different student. Yeah. Now, has anybody got any more feedback from that one before I move on to the next one and start looking a bit more at digital literacies specifically? It looks like not. But yeah, I think we all work to some extent with multidisciplinarity, but I think one of the things that online collaborative design pushes us into is being more multidisciplinary. Okay. Okay, this is getting into some of. Okay, so shall I get into this? Yes, the digital natives thing. Now, I don't know how much of you have come across that idea of the digital native, and what your feelings about the concept of digital nativeness is, but see, the resident visitor thing I've got a bit more tolerance for. Not only because it was a mate of mine who invented it, and so it's like, so David's go back about 10 years, and you know, he's done really well out of it, and good luck to him, because I think it is a useful thing. And what David White, who's the guy who came up with the resident visitor things, has always maintained, as it's not, you haven't got two extremes either of it. The idea, people who aren't, yeah, sure, sorry, beat me to it, I was just about to explain. The idea of a digital resident is somebody who kind of lives online, not necessarily lives entirely, but they'll go onto Facebook, they'll have their social interactions online, they will have experiences online, their online activities has a meaning for them. So they'll have a Facebook profile, and they'll chat to their friends on Facebook. They will maybe have a blog and talk to that. They'll go onto discussion boards or whatever. They'll pass their time sometimes socializing online. A visitor isn't necessarily somebody who's not digitally literate. They might have the literacy skills, but they only use them to go in there, get the information they want, and get away. So they might use Facebook, but they use Facebook because they want to promote something. So they'll go into their Facebook profile, they will put a link in, they might have a quick look at what everyone else has to say, and they'll get off. The same with Twitter, they'll just use it to promote something or to get information. They might use a mailing list, but they will only use a mailing list specifically for specific things. So in something I wrote about at the same time, which wasn't anywhere near as good an idea, which is slightly frustrating, but I was talking about individual learners and group learners. And the idea then is that people might want to learn individually online, or they might want to work collaboratively online. And that doesn't necessarily tie in with whether or not they're individual or collaborative learners offline. And you'll find that some people like to discuss things with other learners. Some people, they don't want to. They just want to fire off an email or get an email back. Now, that's the resident visitor idea, which is kind of, yeah, it's context and it's caveats. If you put enough caveats around it, then it's a great idea. Digital native, the idea of that came around, it's 2001. A guy called Mark Prensky came up with it, and he said that students, people that grew up with the net, think as people that live with, that have, basically they are native to that net generation. Their brain's working a different way. They will multitask more easily. They will think in an online way. They will live there in, but not necessarily like a resident, but live there because that's where they are born. They are native. Whereas people from our generation are always going to be immigrants because we moved into this online world. We learn the language, but we learn it as a foreigner. We learn it as a second language, and so we are always going to be a step behind, and we're never really going to understand where the students are at. Now, yeah. Mark Prensky, about 7 years later, and came up with, he said, oh, actually, I don't like that idea anymore. I'm coming up with something called digital wisdom, which I'm going to talk about later. It's in the presentation. Because I think one of the issues, and it's Helen Beetham, who's one of the people that have really done a lot of research who's mentioned earlier, to kind of hammer nails in the coffin of the idea of the digital native, is that we can presume literacies, we can presume students have these literacies, but that's a wrong assumption to make. They might be on Facebook, but they might not be comfortable with socializing us on Facebook. And one of the things we found out from our BIM Hub project, which because we were pushing the students to work more in an online synchronous way with GoToMeeting, which is a platform a bit similar to this, is that the skills that they had were pretty much non-existent. They might Skype with their friends, but a Skype conversation, which is just going online, clicking a friend's thing, they work, they're in the same country maybe or whatever, and you just happen to sort of chat to them because they were online at the same time, is very different from having a meeting, a work-like meeting, in an online environment with a structure, with a set of etiquette skills, with which needs to be planned and all these sorts of things. that the sets of skills that we presume students have, if you buy into the digital natives idea, do not translate to actually a learning environment and learning activity. The same's true of, say, something like YouTube. I do some stuff with the other project, the Amoris project, has got students to create videos of their favorite books. And these videos are fun, they're great, but because they already create videos and put them on YouTube, does not mean that they have necessarily the skills to make a film about a little video about their favorite book, or to explain what their book's their favorite book, or to then comment, to upload it to, we get them uploading it to Edmodo, which is a sort of educational equivalent to Facebook, which is private and it's got different sorts of functionality, but is essentially the same. But then comment on each other and learn from those comments and build on each other's ideas and share cultural values and share cultural ideas through that medium. You know, they don't have those skills just because they've been on Facebook for all of their lives. And so I think there's an important message, is that you need to give them the time to learn how to use this stuff. You need to teach them some of the skills that are needed to use this stuff, and that you can't just go in there thinking the students are familiar with this because they grew up, they're the next generation and all that sort of thing. Yes, and also I think be a bit upfront about, you must do this, you can't do that for some of the things. I think the last thing I did at JISC meeting was things that we thought the students would do and they didn't, was the theme. And I think that's interesting. Do you want to expand upon that a bit as well, Stefan? That's okay. See, going back to something Satwinder said, ideally they need to practice and develop. Yes, totally. But also I would recommend that you give them a chance to practice and develop before they need to use them for real. Not for real, but I mean, you know, use them in a learning environment. One of the students said they wanted a chance to try before they buy. They didn't really mean that they were going to buy any technology or use something else other than that technology. What they meant was they wanted to try the technology out before they were in a situation where they had to use it in a real live learning situation. So to just play around with it. I used to do a lot of work with Second Life. You know, it's a virtual world, and we would always give the students an hour to just get online and create an avatar and practice all the different skills and moving it around, and then stop, and then next week the following week use it for an actual learning activity. So we would keep it very discreet. This is just a play around. This is just a dry run, a dress rehearsal. This is performance artists, so they got the idea of a dress rehearsal a bit more in before we actually do it for a situation which you're supposed to learn from. And I think that's important. Okay, so see now, for me, this is, I think, what Stefan's raised there is an interesting question, and one that's never really discussed is what do we mean by literacy? Now we know what literacy. You know, we use the words media literacy and information literacy and digital literacy a lot, and I don't want to keep on going on about Rona and Helen, Rona Sharp and Helen Beetham, but since it was Joe that brought them up, and I think they're very informative in this area. But I think for me, digital literacy is also about know-how and confidence. It's not necessarily about handling and interpreting information, but it's knowing about handling technology. It's about not necessarily knowing which button to press, because that's just a technical skill. It's about understanding why you use that particular technology. What technology is appropriate in which particular moment? How do I use digital technology to express myself? And literacy isn't just about knowing that W-O-R-D spells word. It's about having the whole semantic hinterland behind that word. It's about knowing what all the connotations of a phrase is, and its history, and what the right word to use is in the right way. And I think one of the things that we need to get our students to do is, yes, we need to teach them which button to press and how to get online and all these sorts of things. but we need for them to have enough time online, protected from actually being assessed or anything, to develop a fluency and a confidence with it. But we also need them to actually acquire some of the understanding of how do you use it to communicate, how do you use it to express yourself, what choices do you make when you're selecting digital technologies, and when is a good time to turn it all off and do something else completely. And to answer Brian's question about what did we do to prepare our students, we didn't do very much at all. And I think this is the main thing that we would do differently, is actually build in a bit of more time to actually prepare the students more. In some sense, we were actually doing a kind of project which was to identify what some of the skills are as we went through, which we've done, and then see, and now we've got a better idea, we could actually take some of the students through that process. Doubt, and one that I think we would need some maybe feedback from or just play about with a bit more, is that throwing the students in at the deep end to acquire the skills, to acquire the understanding of what needed to be done, actually was a very beneficial process for them. We could see, and if we get time for the videos, I'll show you the videos, we could see the students learning how to conduct themselves online by trial and error and by just practice. Now what we could have done was teach them those skills. We could have just sat down and go, you need to do this, 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 and this. And so therefore they would have progressed a lot faster because they would be further along that process, because we'd have told them what to do. However, as a learning activity, the jury's still out on whether or not that's a better learning opportunity for them. Because whenever we've raised this as a question, people have said, well, yeah, this is actually pretty good for them to learn things by trial and error, rather than actually having been told this. So we still don't know what the best route to go down would be. Yes, making effective use of tools, making effective tools as well. Be a program or be programmed. High-level critical appraisal. That's the phrase. That's the phrase that Helen came up with in one of the GIST meetings, and it's a level of criticality. It's a bit being able to criticize. So good word reading literacy, the normal literacy, traditional literacy, is about critical awareness. Good information literacy, as I'm sure Stefan will back up, is about knowing this is good information, that's bad information. I can tell from this that, I got this off Wikipedia, it's in some doubt. I got this from the British Journal of Medicine, so therefore it's pretty good. I got this from a homeopathy website, therefore I can dismiss it. Those are the different kinds of things that with information literacy we have that critical awareness of, if we've got good information literacy. And yes, that's another webinar. And the social protocols are key, and I think one of the things that when we're looking at the skills that the professional bodies should be pushing are those things about social skills online. And I think this is something as educators we need to do as well, is what are the social practices that help with digital communication, because a key part of trust, of being able to collaborate, is trust. A key part of trust is the ability to socialize and exchange social information. And we do this naturally in a face-to-face environment, but what we don't do, and what the students don't do, and actually the students are probably poorer at, because they've got less practice at it than the older people have, the so-called digital immigrants, is introducing social practices online in order to help the collaboration go on. And we'll see from some of the videos that the social practices, you can see them on the website, but those social practices emerge by the end, but they're not there in place at the beginning. And we'll see the students. In fact, there's one of the videos that we took of the meetings. The students were calling each other not by their names, but by the universities they're at. So the Ryerson students were saying, "Oh, Coventry, can you do this? Oh, Loughborough, can you do that?" And the other students were doing the same. They weren't talking to each other by name; they were talking to each other by institution. That whole social element was completely missing in the original ideas. Okay, that's brilliant. Yes, listening's, yeah. Yeah, and I think this is something that, I think this whole pyramid thing is about the skills in place and then the literacies. Okay, let me move on a bit to one of the first things about, so let's talking about some of the skills in the last 20 minutes here. Okay, so these are the next bit in place, to get in place were the not less on the digital literacy skills, but the skills for collaboration. And these are skills that, because we're working with students in collaborative environments all the time, these were third-year students. This wasn't the first collaboration they did, even though it was the first online collaboration. They had some of these collaboration skills already. What they didn't have were, for instance, there's a tendency, and I think we all do it, but it's something that's worth flagging with students who are doing collaborative design, is to focus on the overall project, the overall outputs, to try and work towards everybody achieving those outputs. And this is not something that the most successful collaborations, all of the students did this, but the medium, what they were successful collaborations, but they weren't the most successful, but they still collaborated. They were only looking at their own outputs. So they would divide up all the tasks between them. They would work towards their own. There wouldn't be anything at the back of their mind thinking, oh, this would be useful for them, even though it's not part of my task. I will give this to them and let them do that. So I think this is something that perhaps we can flag, but on the whole, they've built up a lot of these collaboration skills as they go through their just talking to their buddies and things. But if we look at when it moves to online collaboration, we find that this is where the students do start to struggle. And one of the things where I think the students did display this digital wisdom was we had different technologies. There was the technology that they used for sending information to each other, which was just email. There was a technology they had for sharing files, which they tended to use Dropbox. There was the platform they used for fast, rapid communication, for a quick turnaround, for some socializing. That was Facebook. And then there was the platform they used for synchronous communication, which was GoToMeeting. Now, on the whole, most of the collaborations, most of the students moved effectively between these four different platforms. If they needed a fast response, they would pick Facebook. If they needed to aggregate all of their information in one place and archive it, curate it rather, they would use Dropbox. If they just needed to send a mass of stuff to somebody else or to send them send them a message, they would use email. And this was something that I was quite surprised at how effective they were. Sometimes they would start straying into or blurring those lines, and so they would start sharing files on Facebook. Then they ran into trouble because it's not an effective platform for doing that. So this is something I think which they did get to. Where I think where we were one of the things that did crop up though was this movement from online into online flagged a lot of the issues that they hadn't acquired from the normal face-to-face collaborations. Yes, we gave them. Well, we didn't give them any flexibility in which synchronous platform they used. We insisted they use GoToMeeting, although they didn't always use GoToMeeting. Sometimes they used Skype. But the reason why we used GoToMeeting then was because Skype then didn't allow for, at least I don't think it did, allow for application sharing. Only the professional edition of that does. And now you can use Skype, and they could use Skype for sharing applications. But they needed to be able to show each other the documents they were working on and their CAD diagrams and all that sort of stuff. So GoToMeeting was identified as being the best platform for that sort of stuff. The other things, we let them choose which they wanted to do, and they all ended up adopting the same platforms. So that where there was some issues was was in the applications they were using for designing the stuff, and there were incompatibility problems. So some students would be using Revit and some would be using AutoCAD, and you couldn't share things between them. So I think another thing we would actually make a recommendation for is to identify a common platform that all can use, and then just train your students to use that. And I would also possibly recommend not picking the lowest common denominator, but picking a pretty good one so that everyone is actually then being upgraded to being able to use um, an effective platform for that sort of stuff. We found that students are actually redrawing or recreating the documents one to the other, rather than actually being able to import them from one place to another. Two answers to that about students using their own, about using the technology they want. One is that we kind of presume they know a bit more about what's the good stuff out there to use. Secondly, if they're using stuff they're familiar with, then they're already a bit more fluent with it, and I think that fluency and confidence is an important part of the literacy. But then there's a third reason, and that is that they'll use what they want to use anyway. There's no point really specifying it, because they will go off and pick their own technologies, which I think is an important thing. I think it's good for the students to be able to do that. And I wouldn't always say pick the technology that people already know, but I think because sometimes there's technology people don't know, and there's some really good features in it. But there has to be a really good reason why you would want to use something people aren't familiar with, because the overhead in terms of time and frustration involved in training people to use a technology that they don't like when they would rather use something else is excessive. I worked on one project where the local technology people wanted us to use something else other than Skype. I think because Skype makes too many bandwidth demands and there's some issues about security, so we went along with it, and we just ran into dead ends all the time because all of the participants wanted to use Skype, and so that's what we did. We just went back to Skype. And I think that I'd always recommend using what people know and like, unless you've got a good, very, very good reason not to. Okay. Thanks, Joe. I'll follow up with sort of a bit more advice in the future. So this is something that I think so this is something we were surprised by, was that when we moved into the online thing, then a lot of the stuff that was happening, the literacy skills that they had to develop were about things like scheduling. There are things about making contact and chasing up and emailing and maintaining high communication. And this wasn't something that were useful, even though they'd done collaborations in the past, because those collaborations in the past have been face-to-face ones, and they could be done ad hoc. If you need to chase somebody up with a collaboration, and they're your mates, and you see them, and they'll be in the pub or down the cafe, or you'll bump into the corridor, that's no problem to keep that momentum going. But when we move to an online environment, all of those social skills, all of those ad hoc organizational skills that they'd acquired were no longer any use, because they weren't bumping to people in the corridor because they were 4,000, 5,000 miles away. So they needed to actually back that up with a lot of online activity, which they weren't comfortable with. There were very, very few language barriers, and the students only really encountered those when it came to the synchronous stuff, which I'll talk about next. Working with Canada, the only issues were things like, first floor and second floor were different. There might have been one or two other things, but they got into the habit pretty much of saying our first floor, your second floor, and things like that when they were talking about floors of the building. There were cultural barriers, but I don't know if there were any data environment stuff would help. The whole idea of BIM, the business information modeling, is to use a common information environment, data environment. But no, I think all they needed to actually, as a common environment for all of storing their stuff, was Dropbox. And as long as they archived that, and as long as they took care of version control, curated, not archived, curated that properly, which they all managed to, with proper folders and things like that, then they're all fine. So it didn't become an issue. Okay, so yes, and so this is basically drawing back on what I wanted to identify as being what literacies are. And if we look at the thing that starts with sorry, I haven't kept up with the slides, but slide 6, the slide which says 6 skills for online collaboration, then this leads into one of the things about a literacy of communication, a literacy of staying online. It becomes an ingrained practice. It's something you do regularly to stay in touch. You have to build that into an online working model and do it consciously at first, and the students aren't aware of that because their communication happens ad hoc when it's offline. So scheduling tasks, all those sorts of things. Using the appropriate technologies, so reflecting on it, employing wisdom and criticality, which has been mentioned already, and that's another aspect of literacy. And then finally, the social aspect of media. So improving their social connections and thereby improving their trust, and doing that consciously by using the social aspects of the technologies, by chatting in Facebook rather than just posting information, by including some kind of social aspects when they're sending information and not just relying on it being just an information tool. What the kind of pointy bit on the top of the pyramid, the thing that builds in the skills all the way through. We've talked about digital literacy as far as knowing technologies to use, but I think the most complex set of digital literacies are those that are involved in communicating online in a synchronous way. Through something like this, through Connect or through Skype, or all these sorts of things. As I said, we used GoToMeeting. And you can look at these videos later, they're all on YouTube, but I'll explain what we can see in those. Basically, we gave the students, they had to use GoToMeeting for their meetings. They had to then select all of them are recorded automatically. They had to select one of those to submit to us. Now what some of them did was they didn't realize, they thought they were being assessed on this, and so they've created a perfect meeting which was scripted, and you could tell it was scripted and all this sort of stuff, and it was completely not what we wanted. We should have made it clearer that we just were using it for research purposes. We just wanted to see how they were getting on. And what we could see in the early stages was, well, if you look on the first of those videos, what I call the example of an early stage interaction. I've skipped through it. I've kind of moved the timeline on quite a lot, but you can see that for about 20 minutes, nothing happens on screen. The students are all talking about what they can see on their plans, but they're looking at the paper plans and then just I showed this to David White, who's cropping up a lot today, and he said, well, they're just using it like a telephone. They're using GoToMeeting as if it was a telephone conversation, and they're all chatting and they're saying, look at page 3, and you can hear the rustling of the paper, and then they're all talking about it. What we see at a later stage interaction is, well, it's later in the process of learning, but actually it happened about the same time, but this group just picked it up a lot faster, and these students are saying, oh, look at this, look at that. And they were scribbling on the screen. We can see a picture of it later. As you can see, the way they've annotated things. They skip from application to application, depending on which is appropriate. One of them is actually taking a screen grab of something he wanted to drawn out. I think it was some maths notations. He hadn't been able to put that into a Word document, so he'd scanned it so he could show the other people. And when we look at the transition video, you can see the moment at which these two styles of working happened. And there's a quote in there's somebody saying, look, I'm trying to, one group of people are saying is, here's something going on, we're going to modify this building while it's being used because we're going to close down one bit, open up another, close down this bit. And he explains this for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then he says, wait, I'll show you. And my point is that is actually a moment of transition between thinking in an offline environment, just using the technology as a telephone conversation, and projecting your sense of presence and self into a shared online environment where you're showing, where you're communicating by demonstrating, where you're scribbling on the screen, where you're expressing yourself on screen, and where you have some sort of online presence. So, okay, so yes, I think the face-to-face bit does really help. I mean, the project I'm working on with the Croatian who've lent me this Connect room, there was we had those online meetings with just the project leaders, and that worked well for our collaboration, but we were bringing in teachers from schools, and that was stumbling a bit. And then we had a face-to-face workshop, and that worked really well. I think it was then it was still a bit of a struggle when we went back to moving online. But I think that got fixed by setting up lots of one-to-one interactions. So now rather than trying to get everybody involved in an online discussion group with the teachers on that project, what we instead did was say, well, set up a set of video conferences and then just plan them all and then create these one-to-one conversations. And I think those worked really effectively because they were things that were easy to set up, could be done in a more ad hoc way, and felt less formal than these big open environments like a discussion group where everybody was talking. So I think finding ways to actually make that online thing happen is useful, but nothing can really supplant the face-to-face really. Yeah, Brian is asking Stefan, I think, what did you do in the face-to-face sessions that facilitated better online collaborations? So yes, that's what we did then. Was well, it was hard. It's a difficult thing to identify. But yes, I think setting up, talking to them about who can work with whom, what will actually work over the next few months. What projects can you individually work on? So I got the British people and Danish people working with each other on one particular project. Got another two groups of staff working on something else. And so those sorts of collaborations, I think there was more social capital or social obligation because there was only one other person that they were working with, and so therefore they couldn't take a back seat. And so I think because they were one-to-ones, then I think that actually worked better as an online collaboration. Yeah, and there's nothing beats buying, meeting, going down the pub, having a few beers together, that sort of stuff. I think the issue is you do need to do some stuff to keep it going once you've gone back to being in an online environment, because I think the face-to-face on its own isn't enough to bridge that gap between face-to-face meetings. So I think you do need to have some kind of plans in place to keep the online stuff going. And setting up those plans for online interactions during the face-to-face is brilliant, because if you wait for people to set up the online collaborations once they all go back to being online, it's a bit more difficult to get the buy-in. Okay, so I was just going to go back to summarize some of these literacies, some of the more complex literacies that go with online synchronous communication. I think, and it's the social aspect. A lot of these are the social aspect. We heard conversations like, just a question addressed to everybody instead of specifically one person, because you're used to just saying that and looking at the person. There are no visual cues though, unless you're using, even with web cameras, because you still can't tell who's been looked at. So you need to learn to say, Bryony, what's the answer to this? Or Stefan, what's the answer to that? To actually focus, to fill in for the lack of visual cues. Practice using the software, obviously, but I think the key thing is to think on the screen. To just don't tell and talk about stuff, but show it. To actually have the picture there, to particularly when you're doing this online collaboration for design, you've got to be able to actually see the designs and work on them, to scribble on them, to do what's called this messy talk that's involved around the first areas of online collaboration. And I think somebody mentioned these early stages of listening and empathizing and all that sort of stuff. That's a key point, particularly in this early stages when You've got the architects, you've got the structural engineers, they both have their own view of a project. You've somehow got to bring them together so that idea becomes melded into one. And to do that, you've really got to have patience, but you've also, and listening skills and all that sort of stuff, and also be able to play about with what's online in order to come up with that kind of shared vision, modify each other's work and that sort of stuff. There are some of the sort of more basic elements as well. So we said that a lot of the ad hoc stuff didn't work, and so they had to learn pretty rapidly to do things like have an agenda, to clarify when there was an action point and who was to do an action point. Time zone differences, I was astounded by how difficult, and even still at the end, they were sometimes struggling with the differences in time zone. So again, something that you can't underestimate the problems that people will have, and an essential skill when you're actually working in an online environment, in a workplace environment. They were doing stuff like having their work, they're setting up the laptops in corridors or in the corner of busy, loud library areas, instead of thinking about, well, what is the space I'm in? Does it have good Wi-Fi? Do we have headphones and headsets and all this sort of stuff? So all that sort of thing was also something that demonstrated that although they might have some literacy skills, they weren't efficient literacy skills for industrial practice. And that's a very good question, and no, we don't, because our experience is this isn't really being done enough, not in the construction industry. There are some design industries where they're doing this sort of stuff. I was at a conference that was organised by Mushy Monsters. The gaming industry has a lot of online stuff. The gaming industry has a lot of distributed teams. They're getting a lot of their customers, the kids playing these games, they have a social aspect to them, and Mushy Monsters is a particularly effective one. I don't know if everyone's aware of Mushy Monsters, but it's just an online game, but there's a physical aspect to it because there's actual toys and there's a whole bunch of tie-ins. But there's online stuff which has to be moderated and all those sorts of things. Now, I was asking them, this is fascinating. You've got some examples of these distributed teams. You get these people working. They never really see each other. They're always working online. They're working in their garages and their office spaces at home and all this sort of stuff. Do you have any examples of good practice that you can share with everybody else? And they said, what do you mean? And one of the problems with industry is that this reflection on practice, this identifying of good practice, this dissemination of, well, for a start, it's considered to be, well, maybe this is a competitive advantage. We don't want to tell everybody else how well we're doing it, because then they'll be doing it well and we'll have to compete with them in the marketplace. But also, there's the idea that you don't reflect and you don't gather this information together, because that's a very academic thing to do, and on the whole, they don't have that academic head on. And that's a constant frustration that there's probably masses of really effective practice out there in industry, but nobody's bothering to document it because that's just not what they do. And then the final thing, I've run over a bit, but this was something where I think we definitely have to put in place a set of things where we say, this is what you have to do, rather than allow them to learn by trial and error, even if that is more effective. And we had a deaf student. And we knew they were deaf. Their colleagues knew they were deaf. And he was saying, well, they did some personal reflections at the end, and he said, well, the frustrating thing was when it came to the meetings, the students, the other people in the meetings, I couldn't hear what was going on. And so the people at my end who could lip read had to repeat the questions when they were addressed to me so that I could tell what was going on. And it didn't occur to them to use the chat function. And I just thought that would be self-evident. And that was quite surprising that it wasn't self-evident to them that you've got to have a deaf person involved in the meeting, and therefore you automatically go to using chat entirely. So there are things like that we can't allow them to learn by trial and error. We have to put in place. So it's the social etiquette, social practices, but there's a bottom line whereby you say, actually, you have to get this in place, because otherwise you're not being inclusive enough of what's going on. Okay, that's kind of a quick summary of the main things that we've got from this. If you go to our website, and the final slide has lots of different links on there. So all of this is summarised in some guidance notes. There's the data on there now as well. So if you think, oh, hang on, where have they got this from? We've actually put in some of the analysed data. We can't put raw data in for obvious reasons, but the analysis is in there, so you can actually click on that and see where we got it